Wake up, Tenno.
Good day, Tenno. It's time for part 2 of our deep dive into modding. Last time we looked at where to get some of the must-have mods in the game. Today, we're going to dive a little deeper into how some of these work, specifically the elemental mods, and how their bonuses work on your weapons against the various factions in the game. As usual, we've got a game plan here, and we'll touch on what each element really does and how it works. And we'll go deeper into when and how to combine them on your weapons. We will not be addressing what these elements do to you as a Tenno, as this video and series are about modding, and well, thankfully the Ganir have too much clone rot in their brains to figure out modding. I'm here to make sure you can do it better than them. Before we get going on this somewhat complicated adventure, you can first relieve some anxiety by looking down below this video and clicking the like, subscribe, and little bell buttons so you know when the next part of this series or any other video drops here. The more people that click it, the more algorithms get their robot hearts warmed and decide to show it to more people. But let's give the automations the clicks they so crave. Okay, let's get going with this. Starting off, I'm going to note that anytime you hit with a shot, it's going to do damage on impact based on its various IPS and elements. I won't necessarily mention that with every single element when discussing their effects, but it's important to keep in mind that if I fire a shot that does 100 damage according to my paper numbers and 60 of that heat damage, it is doing that heat damage on impact regardless of whether a status effect is proc. You see a symbol pop up besides the numbers as you are shooting. That symbol shows you that you have inflicted a status on your target of that type. This will all come into play later, but I just wanted to lead with that so I don't have to mention it. Every single element that there is a difference between the damage it does on impact and anything involved with the status proc. You have multiple types of status that could be inflicted. It's almost every single weapon in the game due to IPS. The chance of being the status that is inflicted is based on the amount of damage it does. On my Bratton Prime here, for example, with 160-60 Toxin mod, you see that I have a 41.6% status chance. And if I mouse over that, you can see that the chance per shot of any individual status being inflicted, that all adds up to that 41.6% chance. You can see that Slash and Toxin have an equal chance of being inflicted because they do an equal amount of damage, whereas any other one of these is doing less damage per shot. If I add an additional Toxin mod, this increases, and now my Toxin has a larger chance of being inflicted than anything else, though my total chance to inflict a status is still the same. We aren't specifically talking about that today. It's important to note it here, so when you're building a weapon, you can weight the damages if you so choose. Before we get into the element types, I want to touch on IPS damage, which stands for Impact, Puncture, and Slash, the 3 physical types of damage in Warframe. These do not combine in any manner, so they aren't going to be talked about in depth past right here, but you should know that they each do have a status effect, and they are what comprises your initial base damage on a weapon. If you have a weapon that does 10 damage each IPS for a total base of 30, when you add an elemental mod that says 60% Toxin, it will add 60% of that base damage as Toxin to that base damage. So in the example case, 60% of 30 is 18. You'll have a weapon that does 48 damage total, with that broken down as 10 each of your IPS and 18 Toxin. Each one of these physical IPS parts can impart its own status effect, with impact staggering an opponent for 6 seconds and replacing the oldest stack after 5 stacks. Puncture weakening enemy damage by 80% at 5 stacks and replacing the oldest stack after that. And Slash leaves a damage over time effect that for the record is calculated by base damage modifiers, and mods that increase elements or even ones that increase Slash damage, specifically such as Buzzkill, do not affect the damage ticks from the dot. Clearly out of these, we can see why Slash is the most important of them unless you have a setup that has additional effects based on the others. With that out of the way, we will look at the 4 basic elements. These are the ones that you will find attached to most of your core element mods. Get Toxin first. When you hit an enemy with the Toxin, the initial damage doesn't do anything special, but after the first second, the status procs applied will bypass shields with their damage and hit every second for 6 seconds, making Toxin excellent for any shielded enemies that are vulnerable to status effects. Next, we have Electricity. On status effect with this, the affected enemy is stunned and zaps out damage every second for 6 seconds to everything in a 3-meter radius. Each stack added has its own damage instance and timer going on. Cold is the next one we look at. First stack of Cold applies a 50% slow and a 10% flat crit damage multiplier, and each stack adds 5% more slow and 5% more crit damage, till a total freeze at 10 stacks. At 10 stacks, enemies are frozen for 3 seconds and get a 100% crit damage bonus against them. After that 3 seconds, their stacks of cold reduces immediately back to 3 stacks. Last of the basic elements is heat, which is also the most complex. When you hit with a weapon with heat damage and it procs a heat status, any heat status on them will strip 50% of armor after a period of 2 seconds. A note here that status duration actually lengthens the time that takes, so plus 100 status duration means that it will take heat status 4 seconds to reach the full 50% armor strip. The other and most important part of heat procs is the heat inherit mechanic. When heat status effects are applied, the heat damage percentage of the first proc is applied to all stacks on a given enemy. What this means is if your first stack of heat comes from something that has Hellfire and Thermite rounds on it, for a total bonus of 150% heat, that multiplier is worked into the heat damage tick of later heat stacks, and there is no cap to heat stacks, allowing heat procs to scale infinitely. So looking at this from a mathematical standpoint, the damage per status effect of heat on an enemy is 0.5 times the modded base damage of the weapon used, times 1 plus the heat damage bonus, times the faction damage bonus.
So these parts in blue in this formula will change if you change weapons, or even to an ability, and these parts in green are locked in from the first status in the stack. To make the most of heat inherit, we want to hit first with as much heat damage on a weapon as we can, then use the harder, faster hitting weapons or abilities to hit afterwards so that the status effects that those leave behind, we use the damage on those abilities in the calculation, but use the heat percentage and faction damage bonus of the initial weapon that applied the first stack. With those 4 down, we start combining them for our secondary elements, with the first that we'll touch on being Blast. Blast is made from cold and heat both on a weapon. Status effect procs. After 1.5 seconds, that proc will detonate in a mini explosion for 30% of the initial damage of the shot that inflicted it. If at any point the stat count reaches 10 or the target dies, all 10 will explode, dealing 300% of their explosion damage in a larger radius of 5 meters per stack. This means this is most effective on weapons that can apply 10 stacks very quickly via high status chance and high fire or multi-shot to force all 10 to explode in an AoE multiple times. Beam weapons tend to make especially good use of this, able to stack and detonate on multiple enemies at once for a cascading explosion.
Radiation is next, and its concept is a little less confusing, ironically.
Anyway, radiation is made from heat and electricity, and confuses enemies when it procs a status effect, causing them to attack their former friends and giving them 100% damage bonus against targets that aren't you,
stacking up to 550% at 10 stacks, as well as making their previous friends attack them back. Each stack of confusion has its own timer for 12 seconds, and stacks past 10 will replace the oldest one in that stack. Gas is made up of heat and toxin, and on status effect produces a gas cloud that deals damage each second for 6 seconds to all enemies within a 3-meter radius of the infected enemy. Each additional stack increases the radius by 0.3 meters up to 6 meters total at 10 stacks. Each stack has its own timer, meaning they will fall off 6 seconds from when that particular one was started, and the damage per tick does not scale off elemental mods, but does take into account faction damage mods and elementalist mods. The infected enemy dies, the remaining stacks of gas clouds on the enemy will stay in place the remainder of their duration. Magnetic damage comes from cold and electricity and can proc the disrupt status effect, which on the first proc will amplify damage against enemy shields and overguard by 100% for 6 seconds, with each additional stack adding 25% more to the amplification, capping out at 325% after 10 stacks. Again, each stack has its own duration, and stacks past 10 will replace the oldest one in the bunch. Additionally, breaking an enemy's shield or overguard with magnetic damage will cause electricity damage and status equal to 3% of the target's maximum shields or overguard per magnetic status effect currently on it, for a maximum of 30% of its shield max value in electric damage over 10 stacks. Viral is next, and it's comprised of cold and toxin. On first status proc, it amplifies damage to the health of the target by 100% for 6 seconds, and each additional proc adds 25% up to 325% after 10 stacks. Again, each has its own duration, and each one after 10 will replace the oldest one of the bunch. Viral does amplify against armored enemies with a yellow health bar, but does not amplify damage against shields. The nature of this effect makes it particularly useful with other status effects such as Toxin, which bypasses shields entirely, or Slash, which bypasses armor. The damage ticks of anything doing damage over time check for and calculate damage added by viral as they tick. So if there are 3 seconds left of your viral status and Toxin is applied for a 6-second duration, it will do 3 ticks with extra damage from viral, and it will do 3 ticks at its normal value once the viral has fallen off, assuming that no additional stacks of either are applied to it in the interim. Corrosive is made up of Toxin and electricity. On status, it degrades the armor of the enemy by 26% for 8 seconds, with additional procs reducing it by an additional 6% each for a total armor reduction of 80% at the maximum of 10 stacks. Each proc has its own duration, and any stacks after the maximum will replace the oldest one. The maximum stacks of corrosion can be increased by Emerald Archon shards. Given the math stated, we could tell that 1 normal Archon shard would get us 2 additional stacks at 6% armor strip each for a 92% armor strip. 1 Tau-forged Emerald shard would get us 98% armor strip for the 3 additional stacks it gives us. Or 2 normal shards give us a total of 4 stacks, would get us 104% armor strip, which is more than a full strip. Prior to Jade Shadows, 2 normal Emerald Archon shards was the standard for corrosion armor stripping, but the general consensus with the Jade Shadows armor rework is that 1 Tau-forged green shard for 98% armor strip is generally effective enough, especially if that shard space can be used for something else to increase actual damage output. Looking at all these, we can already see potential combinations. Damaging status effects such as Slash, Heat, or Toxin with something like Viral to multiply that damage. Keep these in mind as we move forward. But merge. I just put 3 elemental mods on my Kuva new core and it looks like it barfed out status effects, but none of them are what I wanted. Relax, Tenno. First off, that's kind of the point of the new core, is to barf status effects, but we'll talk about that in a second. Let's start with how we properly get mods to combine on something more basic, like this trusty Bratton Prime that I haven't even finished unlocking the Incarnate mode for. Looking at an empty version of a weapon loadout here, you'd be surprised to know that mods actually do have an order that they follow. In the case of elemental mods and effects, they start at the top left and go across to top right, then bottom left and across to bottom right. Mods then group in 2s in this order, with only the first in the line counting. Confused yet? Let's give an example. Empty Bratton Prime. Add 1 Toxin mod. Now our Bratton does additional Toxin damage on every bullet that hits. Now let's add cold damage. We now have the percentage of both of these individually combined as a percentage of viral damage, and you can see that on the paper damage of the weapon. We already discussed secondary element combinations earlier though, so now let's get fancy and add another element on here. Let's say Heat. We plop it here at the end, going from left to right and grouping in 2s, the time we have a cold and Toxin becoming viral and heat left over. So our weapon should now be adding viral and heat to every bullet, and our paper damage shows us it does. If we move around the rotation at these same 3 mods, however, we can now get various different elemental combinations. We switch the heat with our Toxin mod. Now from left to right, we have heat and cold being grouped together for blast, and Toxin being left behind. Switch that Toxin and cold now, and we have the first 2 that get grouped, creating gas out of the heat and Toxin, and leaving cold behind for a gas-cold combo. Now that you've got the basics of groups of 2s and left to right down, let's introduce a 4th elemental mod. And let's make it one we haven't used, electricity, and let's start with it at the end. Now left to right, we have heat, Toxin, cold, electricity. And we group in 2s left to right, so heat and Toxin combine to make gas, and cold and electricity combine to make magnetic, giving us gas and magnetic on our Bratton. Just like last time, we can move these around to make any 2 secondary elements we want. For example, if we swap the electricity and heat mods, then group from left to right again, we get electricity and Toxin combining for corrosive, and cold and heat combining for blast. So we've got locked down that we combine 2 at a time, left to right, but what happens if we add a second heat mod in there? The answer is it just makes the first heat mod bigger. So if we add a second heat mod at the end of all this, you'll notice our paper damage types didn't change. The heat one just got bigger. Remember, only the first instance counts. So moving the second heat mod around even does nothing to change the type of the damage that we are outputting. For all intents and purposes, as far as the damage types of the weapon go, we can just add the percentage from the second mod onto the first mod. Wherever that first mod goes is what's going to adjust our elemental types. Now you've got that down, it's time for me to mess with your head some more. You know how we talked about orders and elements, and this is our pathway here? Well, now let's complicate all of that with frame abilities and weapons that have inherent bonuses already. First, we'll start with an easy one. We'll take a Kuva weapon that has a primary element progenitor bonus on it. In this case, we'll look at the Kuva Heck, which in my case, this one has the Toxin progenitor bonus. Taking that over here to our layout, where do we put that Toxin bonus? Well, now we're going to add another row, but this one is all in our imagination, and it's always in the same order. This row is generally known as HCET or HCET, standing for Heat, Cold, Electricity, Toxin. That's the order it's always going to be in no matter what, and we're going to plug our additional modifiers in there when we have them. So our Toxin modifier goes into the Toxin spot in here, because again, the HCET order never changes. Thus now having that Toxin element placed, let's place some mods, and use the same rules as before and see how that affects us. Let's start with the Cold mod. Plop that in the first spot. If we go down through the order and group in twos, we combine the Cold mod with our additional Toxin, and boom, viral. Easy enough. Now let's add another one, a Heat mod. As expected, group in twos, Cold and Heat makes Blast, go down the chain. Toxin is what's left by its lonesome, and we indeed have a Blast and Toxin on the weapon. All of this follows the same strategy. The only thing to really keep in mind is if you're trying to make specific layouts for secondary elements that involve the bonus the weapon already has. So let's say we want to put Viral and Heat on this hack. We have to remember where Toxin is placed at. We have to put our Cold mod on, we have Viral. If we put our Heat mod on, we get Blast Toxin. Remembering our previous rule that only the first instance of an element counts then, in order to move where Toxin is placed so we can get Viral Heat, we need to add a second Toxin mod and place it where we want the Toxin to be in our order. In this case, we want Toxin to be grouped with Cold, so we can put Toxin mods somewhere where the grouping of the two will make Viral. Here works. And we can have Cold and Toxin mods making Viral, then Heat on its own, and the Toxic progenitor bonus adds on to the Toxin mod. Okay, got all that? Good. Time to get more complicated then, or rather, it will look more complicated. But using what we already know, you'll see it works the same way. The Tenet Glaxian with a single element progenitor. Sounds easy, but don't forget the Glaxian has an inherent Cold bonus. So we start this off with two separate sections of HCET already filled in, the Cold and the Toxin. With nothing on here, you can see we're already creating Viral. Again, using what we've learned, let's stick on a Cold mod. Cold and Cold stack on the first instance of it, go down the list after in groups of two to pull in Toxin, and we still have Viral. Let's try another one and go with the Electricity. Same rules. Electricity combines with Cold for magnetic, Toxin left over. Why are we talking about this if it's the same? Because this is also how Warframe abilities tie in if they give single elements. For example, Volt's shock ability with the augment Shock Trooper. We apply Shock Trooper's electric damage to this weapon. We have the electricity element combining with Cold for magnetic. Then the electricity from Volt's ability boosting the first instance of electricity, then Toxic left on its own again. Now, we can't see the results of the electric boost from Shock Trooper on our paper damage, but let's go shoot things and look here. Still magnetic and Toxin. In fact, looking back on it, we don't even need an electric mod to get that if we just look at our orders again. This weapon completely empty should give magnetic and Toxin, despite the paper damage showing Viral, because we know we are going to use Volt's ability, which will combine it into this. And the paper damage does not. That's why it's important for us to actually know how this works before we go messing up our own modding with abilities. If we want Viral on this weapon, but know we're going to use Volt's ability, we have to mod in a way, even with these HCET items here, we would get Viral. Usually that means we have to put the mods on here anyway, because doing so will create a first instance of the elements we want to create in the order we want. So the Viral we want Cold and Toxin next to each other and grouped together. Compared to what we already have, that means we just want Toxin on the other side of the electric of Volt's ability. So we can put a Toxin mod on here and create the first instance, and our order will be Toxin and Cold grouped, electric, and the last Toxin buffs the first instance, making electric stand alone. So after Volt's ability, this weapon with one Toxin mod should give Viral and electric. Well, would you look at that? Last little subsection of this here is weapons that have secondary element progenitors or abilities. This applies to Kuva or Tenet progenitors, weapons that have viral alt fires, or even Warframe abilities like Saren's Venom Dose. Most confusingly, it even includes secondary element mods like radiation mods. Here in our example, we will use my Kuva Kurak that also has a radiation progenitor. We're going to once again create an extra area in our minds. This one though has no order, and it's just kind of a giant bubble of secondary elements that cannot be separated. So this Kuva Kurak with radiation starts out with radiation in that secondary bubble oblivion, and we ignore it in the modding process. All our other modding orders will act like nothing is in this bubble. So if we put a heat mod on here, it does not combine into the radiation unless we also add an electricity mod that would combine it into radiation normally. If you put a toxin mod on one with viral, it will not combine into the viral. This is what allows certain weapons to get some rather crazy combinations that are otherwise not possible. Okay, still with me? Take a breather, and while you're at it, go ahead and hit the like, subscribe, and bell below to help this channel reach more people so I can keep putting these out. I really appreciate all of you who've already done it. So we're almost done here. Let's give the craziest example we can think of, and then take a quick look when to use all of these. We're going to take the Kuva Nucor, which has built-in radiation and a magnetic progenitor, and we're going to put it on one of the most common yet complicated frames to put it on, Saren, running Venom Dose Augment on her first ability and using Toxin Clash. And we'll make it even crazier, we're going to run Nourish. Using our chart and what we know, so we can still keep track of this ridiculousness. Knowing we are going to use Nourish and Venom Dose, and the weapon already has magnetic and radiation, all four of these are going to go into the bubble of secondary elements. We also know we are going to use Toxic Lash. That is not going to combine with any of our other mods, and it's its own damage instance because Saren is broken as and we love her for that. So already your Nucor is going to be doing magnetic, radiation, corrosive, viral, and toxin damage. Knowing what we know, we've seen that all of these are in the bubble. We have a blank slate for modding, except if we combine the modded elements into one of the secondary ones. So if we put a heat mod on here, we will do heat, magnetic, radiation, corrosive, viral, and toxin. But if we add an electric one also to make radiation, then it combines with the radiation that exists already in the bubble. Same for if we put on a radiation mod. That means our options are to put either a single element on here, or to create one of the elements that aren't already in the pile, or both. So what isn't in that pile? Let's go with blast. Heat and cold. We also want a single element. But we can't use heat or cold, as they'll just add to blast. And fortunately, we can't make gas as a secondary element, because the heat to make it would combine into the blast we already have. So we have electricity or toxin. We already have toxin coming in from the non-combining Toxic Lash, so let's run with electricity. I will keep our mod order safe if a random volt decides to give us electricity damage from Shock Trooper, because it will contain the electric buff where we want it in our order. All combined now, we have radiation, magnetic, viral, blast, electricity, and toxin. Hard to see in this mess of numbers, but they're all there. That's a lot of elements. Speaking of elements, Merch, you said you'd tell us when to use which one. Convenient for me, it's convenient for you now. Since Jade Shadows, they have massively simplified things, and each faction now has very specific weaknesses and resistances. Here's a lovely chart of what those weaknesses are. They can also be found by holding your cursor over the mission you're about to enter, and you'll see the damage it suggests there. Now, the inconvenient part for you is that this only specifies the damaging element weaknesses that it gets a multiplier from. So corrosive does 1.5 times damage to Grenier. It does not include status effects that are often more useful than the elements involved. At the bottom of this list, we're going to add in here Toxin and Slash. Slash being one of your IPS abilities, but relevant for this chart. Slash bypasses armor and damage calculations, and does damage directly to shield or health. So it's useful against high armor targets with no shield, such as all types of Grenier and Beefier Infested. Toxin bypasses shields and does damage direct to health, so it's obviously makes short work of most Corpus troops. Okay, that was a lot, I know. Hopefully some of it helps you as you look at the weaknesses on enemies in your progression and wonder just how to fit the elements you want on your weapons. Next time in part 3, we'll go over additive and multiplicative damage, crit chance and damage, all the fun stuff, and how to start putting this all together. Till then, thanks for tuning in. Happy hunting, Tenno.